Good night from Jerusalem. Good afternoon to our viewers in North America, and good late evening for our friends in Europe. Welcome to our special evening. I am Ambassador Yossi Gal, proudly serving as the Vice President of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I'll be moderating this evening's webinar. Friends, we are 347 days into the war imposed on us by Hamas on October 7th. 101 of our brothers and sisters are still held hostage in the dungeons of Gaza, and we, like everybody else, pray for their immediate release. We at Hebrew University, like everybody else in Israel, we are affected by the war. And tonight we want to discuss one aspect, a topic that we defined as challenges and solutions, the case for Hebrew University in navigating its way with the attempts to boycott academia. We are very, very happy to have with us tonight as the main speaker one of the most brilliant young law professors in Israel. Professor Barak-Corren received her first degree in law and cognitive science from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, naturally valedictorian, and 3 times recipient of the Albert Einstein and Rector Awards. She then clerked for the president of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Dorit Beinish. Then she followed and pursued her doctoral studies at Harvard, graduating in 2016. Netta taught at Chicago Law School, at the University of Pennsylvania, Carey School of Law, and was a visiting fellow at the Ethics Center in Harvard University. But on top of all of her qualities and areas of interest, she is at present the head of a very special Hebrew University task force charged with this issue that we're going to talk about. Alongside with her, there are 4 of us, the present and the former provosts of the university, and 2 vice presidents, my colleague in charge of international academic collaborations, and yours truly. Here is the order of the evening. Netta will speak for about 20-25 minutes. You are in the process, you are invited to use the Q&A function to send your questions. Both Francine and Mara will be taking the questions, and at the end of the presentation, they will present the questions to Netta. We will have about 25 minutes for that part of the evening. I promise that we will end this evening no later than 1 hour since we started. So with this, I turn the floor to Professor Netta Barak-Corren. Netta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone who joined us tonight. And without further ado, let me walk you into what has increasingly become our world at the Hebrew University and among Israeli universities more generally since October 7th. So I'm going to begin with a few brief examples of the kind of cases we're dealing with. So consider a senior biologist who is abruptly informed by her European partner that their research collaboration must end immediately due to his university's decision to boycott all Israeli universities. Now, the 2 of them are part of an EU-funded consortium. They co-supervise students. They're in the process of writing a few joint articles, and they also share a patent together. Neither scientist want to sever their ties, but they're bound by the directive from above. A second case, a feminist scholar has been working for months on organizing a set of panels in an international conference, enters a boycott decision by the organization behind the conference. The scholar is immediately excluded from the conference that she designed. Her work and ideas are appropriated by the organizers, and the carefully curated panel that she conceived, which is a multinational discussion of the impact of war on women with Palestinian, Israeli, and other conflict zone speakers, is going to take place without its sole Israeli voice. The Palestinian scholar has been retained, of course, but the sole Israeli speaker has been kicked out. Third case, a delegation of Israeli high school students have spent months training for a major scientific Olympics amid all of the wartime challenges that you can think about, is now barred from physically attending the competition as the hosting country boycotts Israel. A few days before the event, where they're supposed to participate remotely, several Arab delegations demand the complete ousting of the Israeli delegation, such that they won't be able to even participate remotely. The 100-country body votes to erase Israel from the global map, only days after the Israeli youth earned the second place among all competing nations with 3 gold medals. So from now on, the decision, those that competed could keep their medals, but from now on, Israelis will no longer be allowed to compete under the Israeli flag, only as stateless individuals. And the chairperson of the assembly, an Australian computer scientist, thanks his peers for doing the right thing for Gaza. Now, these are 3 definitely not isolated, in fact, quite representative, de-identified incidents that are part of an unprecedented wave of academic boycotts that began after October 7th. And among the various implications of this boycott, we have seen grant applications that were halted, collaborations that were canceled, articles that got rejected, student exchanges that were indefinitely suspended, and various other more ramifications. And of course, the boycott movement on some level is nothing new. And in some ways, the boycott has been accompanying Israel as a country since its inception. But never before has Israeli academia faced a wave of this magnitude, of this bluntness, which has already produced in quantitative terms dozens of university-level boycotts, so an entire university that decides to cut all of its ties with all of Israeli universities, and hundreds and counting of individual cases of boycotts that are comprised of both individual researchers deciding to boycott their Israeli colleagues, or the sort of flow and ripples of the university decision that then have a very broad effect on collaborations for researchers within the university. So as a brief introduction for the issue, which is what essentially we're having tonight, I want to say a few things both about the problem and about, I can say solutions, but the kind of both tactics and strategies that we're currently using and developing in order to counter it to the best of our ability. So I already gave you a few examples, but I want to talk a little bit more about what the boycott movement is and what it wants. The boycott movement is part of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, that I feel like in this forum I don't need to talk a lot about because you all know it. But I think it's interesting to sort of notice the historical repetition of it, that with every round of war, it rises again and tries to build on that war in order to gain and garner more support. And maybe the key example is the Yom Kippur War, when Arab states used oil-based economic pressure to isolate Israel internationally, which had quite a huge impact actually on Israeli economy. And while the boycott then initially impacted Israeli trade quite gravely, it also led to stronger diplomatic ties eventually with Western countries and greater self-reliance economically. And this endurance, and I'm sort of telling it because maybe there isn't a good ending in this round of boycott as well, ultimately was what led a few Arab leaders, including Anwar Sadat, to come to terms with Israel's existence and yielded the first regional peace agreement with Egypt in 1979. Now, the current sort of incarnation of the boycott movement is usually credited to the beginning of the 2000s, and it focuses primarily on academia, on Israeli academia. It's very important to say that ideologically, this movement really does not distinguish between the 90s Israel on the sort of western side of the 1967 border and on the eastern side of the 1967 border. It calls openly to boycott all of Israeli universities, all of Israeli cultural institutions. It attributes blame and moral stain on Israel as a country going back to 1948 and before. Israel, in all of the BDS, quite sophisticated materials, and these are materials that have been circulating campuses in Europe and North America for the past year intensively. They tell a very single, twisted, shallow, and biased story of both the Arab-Israeli and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and of Israel as a whole under the materials of the movement. Israeli universities are complicit in what the IDF is doing, and what the IDF is doing is discriminating and abusing Palestinians for absolutely no reason beyond them being Palestinians. So it's presented as a racist endeavor that has absolutely no reason. Nothing like terrorism or war or violence is ever mentioned. And I invite all of you to go on the BDS website and sort of see what kind of materials are being circulated there. And what's really, I think, important and troubling is that this basis of arguments and materials have been gaining such momentum since October 7th, particularly since October 7th. In terms of geographical spread, we have seen, and maybe even slightly before that, in terms of timing, we have seen a growing trickle of boycott cases until the eruption of encampments in the United States that then spread to Canada and to Europe. From the encampments onward, the trickle became a flood. So this is really, it was very clear, this is the time where the boycott really picked. And it's not accidental, it's related both to the explicit calls of students and faculty on campuses as part of the encampments to boycott Israel. That was part of their demands to the administrations, both divestment of, from Israel and boycott of Israeli universities. And with the growing pressure that those encampments put on universities, quite a few universities, about 30 explicit boycotts and a few dozens, probably silent, covert boycotts at the university level have been the product of these pressures, as well as many, many, many more sort of covert and overt boycotts at the sort of lower level of specific organs within universities or specific individual researchers. And when we're thinking about, how to handle these boycotts and what can we do about them, I typically divide this to sort of three things or three stages. Sometimes the tactics or the tools overlap, but three stages of operation that we have come to adopt and invent on the go. Because never before we as academia, Israeli academia, have engaged or tackled this challenge, this magnitude before. We always had isolated cases of boycotts here and there, but nothing of this scale or magnitude that really washed us with work and challenges this past year. So I'm thinking about, I think that the following sort of division into sort of three steps or phases that we should think of is helpful. And I would say that it divides into firefighting, prevention, and long-term strategy. So when it comes to firefighting, often what we have discovered is that at the roots of what moves universities to boycott is not necessarily all of the battery of arguments of the BDS movement, because typically university heads are headed by reasonable people. But what is really troubling for them and really hard to deal with is first, that even though they're typically very well aware of the excellence and sort of merits in academic terms of Israeli universities, they have actually very little understanding of our internal working, our student makeup, and how we deal with the sort of day-to-day challenges of living in a diverse society. And they're often very surprised to hear, for example, that almost 20% of the student body in the Hebrew University is actually Palestinian, that we have Palestinian faculty, that we invest a lot of resources, including special programs and special funding in recruiting, retaining, and promoting Arab students. This is all news to them. Part of the reason it's news to them is that because they never bothered to ask before, but the main reason is that the BDS movement is spreading quite a lot of libel about Israeli universities as segregationist universities. I personally have heard from senior faculty the claim that we hold separate classes for Jews and Arabs, which was astounding, but this was said seriously by a serious individual. And we see such claims and misconceptions and utter falsehoods all the time. So in the sort of scope of things that I define as firefighting, often what we do, and we have developed these tools on the go, is that we just tell them who we are. And as simple as it is, and it took us a little bit of time to understand exactly what kind of questions they have, and sometimes to answer them before they even know that this is what's troubling them. But we have developed a set of informational tools and data, database, and arguments to explain to them why it's both deeply unfair and also deeply counterproductive to boycott Israeli universities. Of course, there is a problem with evidence. And that is, first, that many universities don't consult with us and don't come to us with questions before they decide on a boycott. And once they made the decision, it's often quite hard to reverse it for a host of behavioral biases that we need a separate talk to discuss. And also many of them are just not open to conversation with us. And after they make the decision, even if they're embarrassed that they made it for the wrong reasons, it's very hard to reverse course because they're under so much pressure. And even those who consult with us and who want to do the right thing sometimes confess to us in sort of closed meetings that they're under so much pressure by faculty and students that even though they know that the boycott is not right, they still have to do it. They still have to give something to the protesters on their campus. And this has been, unfortunately, a very common theme that we heard from university leaders around the globe, really. And so for this reason, we have been developing a set of tools that partially lies in firefighting as a crucial, urgent way to respond, but I classify mostly as prevention, which is legal tools. So we want to change the cost-benefit analysis such that it would not be the sort of easy, costless, or low-cost option to boycott Israeli universities as a way of alleviating the pressure on campus. And in fact, in most Western democracies, there are a host of anti-discrimination laws that mostly prohibit also discrimination based on national origin or nationality. And in quite a few dozen of states in the United States and in the province of Ontario in Canada, there are also specific laws prohibiting the boycott of Israel. They're not always a super tight fit for the special sort of realm that academia is, but often we can use them to some degree. And there are also rules of regulators of research that we can turn to. So when I say legal means, that doesn't always mean that we're going to court. We typically don't go to court, but we can use credible legal threats, and we can turn to regulators of higher education, of research. In Europe, for example, it's the European Research Council. In other places, it could be bodies like the National Science Foundation and so on. And we could make a case for why imposing a boycott is injurious in terms of academic freedom and discriminatory, and as such violates core principles, freedoms, and rights that come with a legal implication. And we have seen this strategy quite successful, both in pausing sort of rolling boycotts, preventing universities, deterring them from adopting boycotts, and even collapsing boycotts that were already announced, at least effectively, even if not symbolically. So sometimes universities do not retract their boycott announcement, but in effect, they stop placing bars in the midst of researchers stop barring them from doing their work. I think these represent, and that's sort of very generally, I'm happy to really delve deeper into any of these as far as you'd like. But I think, I want to say that I consider both of these, both the firefighting with information and dialogue and communication, and the sort of more preventative legal measures, I consider both of them very important, but wholly insufficient, because in the long term, I think what the boycott movement really exposed to us is that the core issue here is that Israel's very legitimacy eroded to a level that I'm not sure, maybe some of you remember periods where I wasn't born still, but I don't think that we have faced such a huge crisis of legitimacy frequently, at least before. And this is an issue that, ironically, the academia can also get a lot of credit for, because the intellectual sort of foundation of the boycott movement is inexplicably and inseparably tied to entire disciplines in academia that have evolved to create and foster perhaps a narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict as one that is wholly one-sided, often omits any mentioning of important histories that are simply inexistent under this narrative, portrays a relationship between the parties in terms of common research paradigms that have very important origins, but as applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are deeply misguided. Of course, at least some of them, colonialism and post-colonialism, apartheid, genocide, unfortunately, very popular these days, and so on. And so it's not surprising then that the boycott is so successful on academic campuses and academia more generally. It wouldn't have become such a busy front if academia was not also simultaneously the hotbed of the inception of the ideas that that feed the boycott bonfire. And so for the long term, and that these are more, initial and still raw ideas and plans that we have just begun to work on or to think about. I think what we really need to do, and this is a challenge for not just for Israeli academia, but I think for academia, for people who believe in the mission of academia more generally and worldwide, to redeem academia, and to redeem the academic project of what Israel is and what Israel should be, from those very narrow, very insufficient and harmful specific paradigms, into a world where Israel's legitimacy, and among the various institutions of Israel, Israeli universities, among that, is redeemed as well. And I think this is a huge challenge for us, for everyone. But this is ultimately what we will have to do in the long term, because Israeli universities will not be able to claim for much longer all of their, great qualities when Israel as a concept is repeatedly shattered and eroded. We are deeply connected to Israeli society, and so we cannot be left like floating islands in the air, not for long, and probably not even now. So I think I'll stop there, and if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Netta. That was so interesting, especially to those of us who are working in academia, and we've hosted a number of delegations from universities abroad, trying to understand what we do at our university vis-a-vis the crisis that they have found themselves in their home universities. We have a lot of questions, and I apologize in advance that we won't get to all of them, but I'll try to combine when appropriate. Our first question is from Phil Gartenberg. He's asking about if there is any defined party or country that is organizing this activity across universities, if you're aware of that. And just a follow-up question, why does it seem like there are certain universities that are more actively anti-Israel or pro-boycott than others? And is there any reason behind it? Netta, you're muted.
Thank you. So we specifically are not in the business and do not have the means to know whether there are countries behind the scenes funding those movements. As a consumer of information, like any one of you, I have read articles and reports suggesting that this is the situation, but we do not have independent ways to confirm it. It's what is definitely clear is that this movement is very well funded and very well organized, and there are many indications for that. And I say this with much regret, we are not as well funded or organized. Part of this is that we arrived late to the party. The party started without us, and we have been learning and developing as we go. And part of it is that the efforts required in order to counter this movement that has been building for 25 years and has active presence in hundreds of universities around the world, it requires a lot of resources. And I think we will gradually get there, but we are not there yet. Why some universities have more presence than others, that again, sort of relates to, what I could call intelligence gathering, though we don't have a lot of this, has to do with demographics. That at least we know. We know it's more present in universities with larger Arab population, not just Palestinian. And it's very natural because this creates a sort of hardcore and the appetite for gathering around these ideas, and then also the sort of testimony to provide in order to attract more supporters. There has been indications suggesting that it's more prevalent in top universities in the United States than community colleges. I do not know why this is the case. But we do know that a lot of professors are involved. So it's not just students led, it's also professor led. And again, let me just go back to the observation that the fields was sort of like, or the hotbed and the intellectual foundation of the boycott movement are fields like Middle Eastern studies, critical sociologies, and additional areas in the humanities. This is mostly where those professors are concentrated. It's possible that not every university has a big group, but bigger universities might have more resources to put on those areas, and maybe that's kind of an explanation. But I'm really speculating here, and I don't know of any good research that actually found a really compelling reason to, or explanation to explain this variation. We might see something along these lines coming up, but nothing yet.
Thank you, Netta. I have an interesting question from Eric Stein, who asks, how are you going about identifying and communicating with specific universities so they're aware of the truth about Israeli universities, as well as the risks of boycott? Are you thinking of expanding the effort to include external people, like those who are on this webinar participating, who might even be graduates of these same universities?
So this is really a great question. So typically what happens is that a researcher in a Israeli university, it could be a student, it could be a faculty member or a postdoc, or somebody who graduated and is present on a foreign university, somebody would report to us. They would, either suffer specifically from a boycott, or they would report to us that a boycott is being considered. And we have sort of by now an almost automatic set of things that we do when we, of course, each case can be specific and require us to develop something else or tailored in a different way. We now have teams of lawyers that we are working with in Europe, in Canada, and in the United States. So we have much more tools and understand the situation much better than we did when we started. But in general, we have a set of sort of tools to respond and then escalate. But we rely for identification on informants on the ground, people who either suffered or know that something is being considered. And it's really important to say that we do have allies in many institutions, and they come to us. They're like, my university is gonna, there is a motion to vote on boycotting Israel, and I want to have information. I want to fight it. And then we can work together. So if you do know about something, doesn't have to be specifically related to Hebrew University. Israeli universities have now established a national team, and there is a national coordinator. But send it our way. You can send it my way. You can send it Yossi's way. We have become very efficient in moving the information around and responding quickly. So when we do have information, it's typically very helpful, and our chances of stopping or reversing are much higher.
Wonderful, wonderful. And because we actually do have a question from a lecturer at a Swedish university, Natalie Bloch, who says that there have been a few instances of boycott of Israeli guest lecturers as a response to aggressive student pressure. She says she feels very alone when she tries to fight this. And I think you already answered her question by saying she can turn to us and to get advice, support on how to counter these claims. And
Well, probably, unfortunately, and I wish it would have been different. We will not be able to solve the feeling of isolation, being alone on your campus, but we might be able to give tools and at least to that that you're not alone in that sense when you talk to us. And just to say a thing, a sentence on what Natalie sort of brought to the conversation. There are lots of those cases where talks of Israelis either get thwarted or canceled, sometimes due to outright boycott. Many times we're dealing with many such cases out of security concerns. So, and they could be genuine, but the Israeli guest is always a person or the delegation paying the price. And sometimes there are good ways to sort of fight back. Oftentimes, these are the hardest cases because we cannot impose on the universities, on the hosting universities, to hold the event when they're saying that they don't have the resources to protect the speaker.
Yes. Very, very frustrating. There's a question about what are we doing to counter the BDS narrative with the student population? How do we share the historical truths? Is there a way to dialogue with these encampments, with these groups of very mobilized students with very specific ideas about what's going on, whether these are informed ideas or not? Do you have any suggestions on how to engage them in a conversation to help correct this perspective that they have?
So first, I think it's, hands down, very challenging. And it's challenging for a few reasons. First, oftentimes the students derive their arguments about the universities from their arguments about Israel. And so it's a very sort of, the front of arguments is very, very broad. And part of the argument of Israeli universities is that even if you disagree with some of the things that Israel is doing, we are universities, and our mission is to explore and find the truth and do good in the world. And this often, the students can throw this out of the window because their argument is that doesn't matter. You could be angels, but you're part of Israel. And so we don't want to talk to you, and we don't want to hear anything about you even. I think probably a better person to answer this question would be, a Jewish student or an Israeli student on campus trying to enter dialogue. And, I think some of these dialogues have been successful. Many others, there was absolutely zero willingness to hear. But I want to say more generally, because I think there could be like a misconception that we have absolutely nothing to do in terms of talking with students. And I think that's not true, actually. I think we can sort of divide the sort of boycott, influence realm into, roughly three parts. There is a hardcore. There are the ones, who are absolutely 100% committed. They're spreading those falsehoods knowingly. They're like dedicated to creating the narrative, the one-sided narrative of the conflict of Israel, all of that. And they're using all of this to recruit and to expand their circles. And so this sort of second circle, there are many people who are there because they have received this information from people they trust and they believe it, but they might not necessarily stay there if they would have been given more complete information and understanding and narratives and testimonies of the conflict. And then I think the most important circle is the one that's at the periphery of the movement. I call them the undecided, where they get most of their information from the boycott movement, but they still have curiosity and they still sort of want to understand better. So they speak the language of the boycott movement, but if you are able to engage with them and reach to them with information, they often change their minds, and then they can go ahead and, potentially influence others. So I don't think it's like a lost battle. We are currently at the national level thinking about ways to reach the students. There are a few ideas on the table, again, requiring a lot of resources. I sort of have the optimism that we'll be able to have them, but it does require a lot of resources to sort of do good job with it. Two ideas that we're thinking of. One is a campaign sort of showing the sort of real sides, the real face of Israeli academia, its diverse face, the Jewish and Arab students working together on all of the amazing scientific things that people are working on at the Hebrew University and in other universities in Israel. And there's so many examples. They're just, mind-blowing. And sort of we are thinking of going, with a campaign on campuses, sort of, inviting people, if they actually care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to come to Israel to study it, to take an exchange program and work with us, because this is how most of Israeli universities, most of the people working on campus, this is, one of the goals that we strive for, to solve this conflict and to have a better future. And so this is one sort of idea or family of ideas. And then another one is getting student delegations out to the campuses. This is something that I'm currently working on specifically, to get a diverse delegation of students from Hebrew University to go on a tour and to sort of meet and sort of for students in those universities to see for themselves. It's not necessarily as scalable as a campaign, but we would be experimenting with that this fall if things turn out okay. But we already have an impressive interest by students. I was a bit skeptical. It's very hard for especially Arab students to sort of come out and sort of stand and say, I'm against boycott. I'm proud of studying at the Hebrew University. I was quite humbled over the past few days of seeing really brave students saying, I want to do that, but we do have these students. So I'm hopeful we'll be able to get this delegation out this fall.
Yes, that's wonderful. We've had some experience with Arab students and Jewish students who are very happy to stand up in front of visiting delegations to the Hebrew University and say that they are very proud to be students at the Hebrew University, and happy that they're part of a community that can talk to each other still. I have a number of questions along the same lines. Because so many people are interested in doing whatever they can to help fight this BDS movement in universities, they're asking if there is any way to find out if there's a list of US and Canadian universities that are participating in the boycott, whether in individual departments or as an institution. Do we know if any kind of list of this exists?
So we keep for our records lists of boycotting universities, and we have created, in fact, we were the first in the country to create a database of boycott cases that will already allows us to have a broader understanding of the of the hotspots and where we have more or less issues, etc. So we do have lists. We don't publish things before, we have a lot of confidence, and sometimes it's also dynamic. So, to give an example, we did have universities that decided on a boycott, but then upon a series of we engaged with them. There was dialogue, there was exchange of information, and we were able to reverse this decision. So those decisions and this status could change. I want to say very generally that the issue in Canada is really troubling. So in Canada, there are both universities that are sort of serious universities that have voted and like concretely on resolutions to boycott, and in some places it passed. And there are many professor unions and so faculty unions and teacher unions that already adopted boycott decisions. And it's very hard to challenge those decisions. This is not like the university, but it's clear that it's, if it was adopted by the union, it has implications for the university, but it is not. So Canada has a very troubling atmosphere these days. The United States has been more restrained in terms of, the encampment started there, but there were fewer universities that seriously considered a boycott, but we saw a lot at the individual level, and sometimes at the organizational level. I want to be very clear that we will not be able, we do not publish information that can identify people, even if it's, the boycotting person, because it can very easily be tracked to the Israeli scholar who initiated, the report. And people, especially junior folks, are very concerned about how it's going to affect their careers now. And these are serious concerns. And so I want to, just say that there's a limitation to what we can publish. We do have a Canadian list of institutions that is currently being verified by our Canadian colleagues. We have collaborations with Canadian professors on this, and it's possible that we will publish this information soon. There is a website of resources that maybe Francine can later send to everybody who was here tonight, that we put together. It's on our university website of resources, anti-boycott, that we put for everybody to be able to use. And this is definitely something that you can have already tonight.
Wonderful, thank you. I think I have one more question, and then I'm going to have to pass it back to Yossi. A question from Adam Dodek asking, how do you recommend that researchers in North America, and I assume also Europe, respond to invitations to speak, peer review, etc., from a university that is boycotting Israeli universities? It's an interesting question.
It's a really good question. Hi, Adam, I can't see you, but thank you for the great question. I want to say that we have seen it's not always the case, but we have seen the power of a positive sort of role model in several instances before. And in fact, we always try to use it as a tool. So for example, when an Israeli researcher is being boycotted by a conference, if we can, we will try to recruit allies, and it's always better if the ally could be someone like the keynote speaker or somebody important who says, if you're boycotting this Israeli researcher, I'm not coming either. And we had a few such cases that were really inspirational, and a few times it doesn't happen as often as I would like, actually. But when it happens, it often produces the result that like the minimum outcome is that it makes the boycotting university feel very uncomfortable. It sort of puts them on the spot. They try to persuade the person to change their mind. And then sometimes it's also successful in reversing the boycott. And what's good about this scenario is that if it happens in this context of a conference or a workshop, is that the Israeli researcher would often feel much better going also when they know they have allies and that they're not going to get bullied, or, you know, they'll have a friend there. So that's another advantage, because often, you know, this is more generally the case with discrimination more generally. I mean, when people are being turned down, they often don't want to go anymore. So even if we succeed in like legally forcing the hand of the boycotting university to change the decision, they're so aggrieved, but at this point that they sometimes don't want to do it anymore. So I think it's a very good idea. It's a very good move to show solidarity and to show these universities that they pay a price, that they cannot boycott without getting boycotted as well. I wish more people have done that.
Thank you, Netta. Now I'm going to turn us back over to Ambassador Yossi Gal.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Francine. Here's just one additional idea of how you can help. Francine's department, and in fact, the entire university, we've had countless number of solidarity missions this last 6 or 7 months. Practically, I think that we hosted delegations from most of the Ivy League universities in the United States, East Coast and West Coast. We hosted quite a number of education officials from all the different lenders in Germany. We visited ourselves universities in the Netherlands and Belgium. And as Netta said, many of them are surprised, first of all, to know that 20% of the student body are Arabs. Many of them are surprised when they see that the signage on the walls of the Hebrew University are trilingual, Hebrew, English, and Arabic. Many of them are very surprised when they meet an Arab vice president of the Hebrew University. And all of them are surprised to learn that there has not been one single incident of violence between, any of the 7,000 soldiers that came back, students that were called for duty and came back to study, and the 5,000 Arab students that we have. Not a single incident of violence. So I think that these missions are in a very effective way. We'll do our best to host each and every such a group, because as Netta said, I mean, the facts are very, very are ignored by many people. I just want to say that I'm extremely happy and pleased to see the number of people that were on this call. And last but not least, I want to thank Netta for her brilliant expose and for leading the task force. We are all at your disposal. Of course, you can write to us, you can call us, and I believe that together we can. Thank you very much. Toda rabah and good night from Jerusalem.